absolutely delighted to have as our guest Professor Dirk Uffelmann from the University of Passau, where he is professor and chair of the program in Slavic languages, literatures, and cultures. He has taught at Passau since 2005, and he's been the head of the program there since 2009. He has also held he has taught at several other universities before in Germany, and has held visiting positions at universities in the United Kingdom and the United States. He has also now been for about 10 years one of the co-editors of the leading Slavic Studies journal, Zeitschrift für Slawische Philologie, and he's been very active both in publication of monographs, but also scholarly articles and edited volumes. The full list of his publications, which we can find on the website of the University of Passau, is 30 pages long, so I will not recite.
I'm sorry for this.
Yeah, no need to apologize. But he's been also a wonderful colleague in that he has been putting a lot of effort in bridging many national communities and national cultures of studying countries of the region that is the focus of our attention, including Russia, Poland, Ukraine, and others. He has co-edited, for example, the influential volume titled Tam Vnutri with Aleksandr and Ilya Kukulin, published by Nové Literatury Magazine. He also co-edited a volume titled Post-Colonial Slavic Literatures After Communism, in which I'm honored to be one of the contributors. Also, one of the wonderful things about the work that they're doing at the University of Passau is that this is one of the leaders of research in the Slavic field, employing the tools and intellectual paradigms of digital humanities, and we are really grateful to them for doing that. And closer to the topic of today's talk by Professor Uffelmann, he also co-edited a journal, special journal issue on one of Russia's leading contemporary writers, Vladimir Sorokin, and is now also editing a companion to Vladimir Sorokin's work, which is forthcoming from Academic Studies Press, a major academic publisher in Slavic and Jewish studies based in Boston. So, with all of this, please join me in giving a warm welcome to Professor Dirk Uffelmann.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction, Vitaly, and let me also thank all the people who have contributed to the organization of my talk, including Professor Winek. I'm extraordinarily happy to be here at the University of Kansas and to have the opportunity to share with you some of my thoughts on Vladimir Sorokin, Aleksandr Dugin, and the Eurasian Retrofuture. I will start with some very, very general considerations about space and time, before turning to Aleksandr Dugin's militant geopolitical ideology of Neo-Eurasianism, and then to Vladimir Sorokin's literary take on it. When reflecting on the relevance of space and time for both literature and political philosophy, I will provide an introduction to one of the most important literary scholars of the 20th century, to Mikhail Bakhtin. In the part on the so-called Neo-Eurasianism, I will present you with one of the most unpleasant militant thinkers of Russia today, who, however, is unfortunately extremely important, among others, for the war in eastern Ukraine. In 2017 we are, 3 years after the annexation of Crimea and the devastation of Donbass, the deconstruction of the spatial turn in political science appears more pressing than ever. There had been an earlier turn toward linking space and politics, beginning in the 1910s, called geopolitics. One of its main proponents, Karl Haushofer, inspired Adolf Hitler's military expansion to Eastern Europe. That's why after World War 1992, geopolitics was banned and geographical arguments disappeared from political science. Only in the 1990s this changed due to the so-called spatial turn. The unlearning of the lesson of the fatal association of National Socialism with Haushofferian geopolitics in the wake of the spatial turn and the rehabilitation of a realist geopolitics in political science, especially in post-Soviet Russia, had their share in making Eurasianist geodeterminism acceptable. With the latter, expansion became an option of realpolitik again. And as it turned out, those who had argued that the near abroad, above all, was a natural space for Russian expansion, appeared to have anticipated the annexation of Crimea in 2014. In my paper, I address the geopolitical naturalization and essentialization of constructed spatial units such as Eurasia. The neo-Eurasianist discourse uses geodeterminist presuppositions for the sake of raising a geoculturological claim of the hegemony of one particular culture, the Russian one, over the others. What a geopoetical perspective on literature, like the one envisaged by German scholar Susi Frank, has to offer is contemplation of the counter-offers of literature. Among the strategies of geopoetic de-essentialization, privatization and micro-localization of a space so blatantly essentialized and collectivized by geopolitics, Susi Frank mentions the capacity of literature to conceive specific chronotopes, constellations of space or topos and time or chronos. In her Geopoetics of 2014, Polish theorist Elżbieta Rybicka analogously includes the connection of spatiality and temporality in her list of consequences of the spatial turn. In my talk, I want to focus on the co-development of space and time in literature and reinsert the dimension of time, which is so fundamental for literary geopoetics, also into geopolitics. Readdressing Karl Schlögel's appropriation of Friedrich Ratzel's dictum "In space we read the time" to the obsession of Eurasianism with space. My research question is, what is the time of geopolitics? More specifically, whither is the chronotope of Eurasianist geopolitics? The answer I propose is Retrofuture. I first aim at detecting the retrofuturistic chronotope in Eurasianist geosophy, with which term I stress the reductionism as represented by Aleksandr Dugin's binary thalassocracy versus telurocracy. This will then allow me to read the geopoetics inherent in literary reflections of the neo-Eurasianist geopolitics, such as Vladimir Sorokin's novel Teluria of 2013, as a political intervention. I conclude with claiming Sorokin as a political scientist and literary theory as a means of the study of political philosophy. For this double political, philosophical and literary purpose, I have to briefly remind you of the interconnectedness of time and space inherent in the composite chronotope, as proposed by the Soviet literary theorist Mikhail Bakhtin and inspired by the most important philosopher ever, Immanuel Kant. Bakhtin's canonical definition from his Forms of Time and Chronotope in the novel from 1937 goes as follows, and I quote Bakhtin: "We will give the name chronotope, literally time-space, to the intrinsic connectedness of temporal and spatial relationships that are artistically expressed in literature. What counts for us is the fact that it expresses the inseparability of space and time." End quote. Since I've started from spatiality, I quote only the impact of time and history on space, which Bakhtin diagnoses. Space becomes charged and responsive to the movements of time, plot, and history. As early as page 2 of Forms of Time and Chronotope in the novel, Bakhtin provides a footnote referring to Kant. Quote, in his Transcendental Aesthetics, one of the main sections of his critique of pure reason, Kant defines space and time as indispensable forms of any cognition. In the long tradition of Russian philosophical deliberate ignorance of the peculiarities of Kant's philosophy, especially when it comes to time and space, Bakhtin adds the reservation, and I quote Bakhtin again, here we imply the Kantian evaluation of the importance of these forms in the cognitive process, but differ from Kant in taking them not as transcendental, but as forms of the most immediate reality. This invective against the transcendental, which we might rephrase today as constructivist, reduces the productivity of Bakhtin's theory for analyzing geopolitics as co-constructed via time. Thus we have to go back to Kant in order to armor our deconstruction of the Eurasianist geodeterminism and pseudo-objectivism with his definition of time and space as a priori intuitions. In his magnum opus, Critique of Pure Reason from 1787, Kant resumes his findings. It is therefore, and I quote Kant, it is therefore indubitably certain that space and time, as the necessary conditions of all outer and inner experience, are merely subjective conditions of all our intuition. Subjective conditions of all our intuition. This is the main point. And that in relation to these conditions, all objects are therefore mere appearances and not given to us as things in themselves which exist in this manner. Kant's insight into the constructedness of outer objects should also make scholars participating in the political discourse about space approach cautiously when somebody ascribes spatial concepts an objective, let alone determining status. A rather trivial example. Do we have a world map here? No, we don't. A rather trivial example. There is no objective natural border between Europe and Asia. To use the Ural Mountains for this purpose is no more than a voluntary decision. As Kant presupposes, outer space is not conceivable without the even more intrinsic intuition of time. Just as I can say a priori that all outer appearances are in space and are determined a priori in conformity with the relations of space, I can also say, from the principle of inner sense, that all appearances whatsoever, that is, all objects of the senses, are in time and necessarily stand in time relations. Two conclusions can be derived from Kant's transcendental idealism for our particular case of geopolitics. 1. Even the most space-obsessed Eurasianists are unable to think of space beyond the category of time. And 2. Their notions of Eurasian, Russia-centered spatiality should be conceptualized together with their co-constitutive concepts of time. Which then is the time concept that constitutes the spatial ideas of Neo-Eurasianism. In my talk, I can focus only on one variety of post-Soviet Neo-Eurasianism, the one represented by Aleksandr Dugin. Most productive for my analytical purpose among his numerous books are his Russian Logos, Russian Chaos, and The War of the Continents, both from 2015. This is out of some 70 books authored and copy-pasted by Aleksandr Dugin. There is much repetition in this enormous oeuvre, nevertheless. Space is not only prominent in Dugin's programmatic formulas such as thinking in space and territorial thinking, but omnipresent in his various, often redundant works. Here it must suffice to say, to quote Dugin's term, which is of key importance for my combined analysis of Dugin and Sorokin, telurokratia. It is part of what Dugin sells as the main law of geopolitics, as a discipline. Through this alleged law, he naturalizes and essentializes his own ideological dualism, from which he then deduces his preconceived political and military conclusions. And I quote Dugin. The main law of geopolitics is the assertion of the fundamental dualism which is reflected in the geographic nature of the planet and the historical typology of civilizations. This dualism manifests itself in the opposition of telurocracy, land power, and thalassocracy, sea power. Obviously, telurocracy is Eurasia, with Russia as its center, and thalassocracy is the British Empire and the US. Dugin projects his own hatred of the West onto this ostensibly self-evident binary and elevates it to the status of a panchronic animosity. As a counterweight to the accursed thalassocracy of the US and the UK, telurocracy is identified with the intercontinental spaces of northeast Eurasia, more or less coincident with the territories of Tsarist Russia and the USSR. Thus, Dugin reproduces, naturalizes, and spatializes the historically contingent dividing line of the Cold War from 1948 to 1990. Dugin reduces this historical pattern of his thinking to one occasional appearance of an eternal dichotomy. In his view, it is spatial realities that determine concepts of time, and I quote Dugin again, the place where any people or state development happens determines to a great extent the path and sense of this development, up to the point when the two elements become one. Given the concrete focus on telurocracy, land power allegedly embodies the spatial preconditions of sedentariness and conservatism. Time is obviously much less present than space in research on Eurasianism. In the following, I mostly rely on the comprehensive chapter, The Construction of Time and History in Aleksandr Dugin's Ideology, of Alexander Höllwert's Austrian PhD thesis from 2007. Höllwert points to the manifold contradictions in Dugin's combination of traditionalism, Russian history, and geopolitics, and deconstructs Dugin's allegedly unilateral traditionalism as, and I quote, modernization without westernization. Höllwert's deconstruction implies that the past is not as important a guideline as some researchers assume, even if new Eurasianism is programmatically retrograde, referring to the first wave of Eurasianism of the 1920s. Some of Dugin's claims indeed sound temptingly clear. Quote, ancient means good, and the more ancient, the better. The praise of archaism and pre-modern irrationality is, however, again induced by the spatially defined enemy, the West. Dugin's idolatry of the archaic is born out of his critique of Western modernity imposed on an archaic world, among others on Russia or Eurasia. Dugin's argumentation even turns against time itself. not unexpectedly with the help of a spatial metaphor. Quote, "Conservatism constructs a topography that rejects the logic, work, and direction of historical time." Dugin makes an appeal to abolish time as a destructive quality of reality. His skepticism against technical progress sometimes amounts to formulations such as active anti-modernism. Are then those who unanimously inscribe Dugin into the paradigm of traditionalism right anyway? No, because in other instances he uses the contrary notion of the unmodern in contrast to the anti-modern. Quote, "The fourth political theory, which is Dugin's own theory, does not just discard progress and modernization, however. It is not an invitation to a return to traditional society," Dugin claims. Even more obvious is the inconsistent combinatory strategy when we take into account Dugin's embrace of modern means. For the sake of promoting the Eurasianist project, Dugin makes ample use of the technological means of Western modernity and criticizes those conservatives who refrain from doing so as naive. The latter is especially obvious from Dugin's proactive use of YouTube for his propagandistic video messages reaching out to pop culture.
Здравствуйте, вы смотрите программу «Директива Дугина». Поговорим о ШОС, объединяющей крупнейшие страны Евразийского континента, саммит которых состоялся в Ташкенте. И самое главное, поговорим о том, что такое Евразия. Ведь эта тема была также центральной на недавнем Санкт-Петербургском экономическом форуме.
Мы совсем недавно в Астане обсуждали это и считаем в этой связи и предлагаем подумать о создании большого евразийского партнерства с участием Евразийского экономического союза, а также стран, с которыми у нас уже сложились тесные отношения. Китай, Индия, Пакистан, Иран и, конечно, имею в виду наших партнеров по СНГ, других заинтересованных государств и объединений.
Евразия – это не только географическое понятие, это целая теория, система, это особое мировоззрение.
You can spend hours and days watching Dugin on YouTube, so I will not take your time with this now. But I think it becomes very obvious that this is not performatively anachronistic and anti-modern in the use of technological means. The same is true about publishing. The last years have seen an enormous advertising campaign for Dugin's thinking on Western book markets, which relies both on the global role of English and on modern communication technologies. His proposal of an autonomous Eurasian internet with a top-level domain .ea and his plea for a strategic development of a Russian cyber war force betrays advanced familiarity with internet jargon, such as effects-based operations. The same militant appropriation of modern warfare applies to his approval of Russian weapons of mass destruction and his threatening references to the nuclear potential of the Russian Federation. It is by using and perfecting the technological means of modernity that Dugin proposes to get rid of the Western dimension of this modernity and to reverse time. Here he explicitly refers to Nikolai Berdyaev's New Middle Ages. In my view, Dugin's insistence on the reversibility of time relies on the non-linear time logic of retrofuturism. No doubt, optimizing modern technology for the anti-modern purpose can be seen as a paradox, but not as a paradox of which Dugin would not be aware. In present societies, he diagnoses as a synchronous coexistence of pre-modernity, modernity, and post-modernism. This implies, if we are to believe Dugin, an outstanding opportunity for Russia with its distance to Western modernity. a chance to combine elements from different historical paradigms. And I quote, "Russia can stay an empire and absorb high technology. It can live according to the laws of traditional society and impose democratic institutions. It can combine authoritarianism and freedom, ethical uniqueness and the internet. Postmodernism allows choosing other trajectories where they have never been, since the main law of this postmodern style is the combination of the incompatible, fine irony, a distance towards simple repetition." Under such auspices, even the negative feature of archaeomodernity can be inverted in a way reminiscent of Henry Louis Gates' signifying or Homi Bhabha's mimicry. The mess of archaeomodernity should be re-evaluated as a subversive strategy with which Russians mock Western modernity. And I quote again, "We see that archaeomodernity is a result of a secret underground activity of the archaic principle that methodologically and consistently sabotages the integration of the Russian society into a West European fate. It is an invisible but consistent, stubborn, volitional and clearly structured resistance." For Dugin, the future of Russia lies in the appropriation of time paradoxes. Quote, "There is an archaeomodernist something which theoretically can become the Russian society of the future." Here Dugin arrives at temporal paradoxes in a playful way when he proposes a transition from the linear and progressivist time of Enlightenment to a fragmentary recycling of extravagant quotations in the post-historical perspective of postmodernism. This I regard as justification of my thesis that Dugin's neo-Eurasianism can be identified as retrofuturistic. Does Dugin's retrofuturism, however, fit with existing definitions? In the American context, retrofuturism was defined according to two vectors. In a more rigid definition, retrofuturism comprises reappropriations of imaginations of the future from past periods of human history. Quote, "If futurism is a term that describes our anticipation of what is to come, then retrofuturism describes how we remember these visions. In a wider, less systematic sense, it is used for any creation of hybrid temporality, blurring past and future, that messily integrates many temporal moments. It is especially the latter where nostalgia comes in, adding a political axiology." Quote, "Retrofuturism suggests an alternative path, and in addition to pure nostalgia, may act as a reminder of older but now forgotten ideals. This dissatisfaction also manifests as political commentary in retrofuturistic literature, in which visionary nostalgia is paradoxically linked to a utopian future modeled after conservative values." End quote. The second definition comes very close to Dugin's version of Eurasianism. A positive nostalgia is, however, at odds with Elizabeth Guthrie's evaluation from her 2006 book Retro, The Culture of Revival, of retrofuturism as an ironic, even sardonic evocation of the past. What is more, with few exceptions, American varieties of retrofuturism mostly refer to the recent past of the 20th century. And I quote Guthrie, "Retro does not glance nostalgically at pre-industrial times." This, however, is in stark contrast to Eurasianism's fascination with pre-modernity. Its overt anti-modern via anti-Western, anti-globalization stance. The temporal logic of the Eurasianist version of retrofuturism is as paradoxical as the various American and West European varieties, but it has neither a mild, nostalgic, nor self-ironic turn to the tradition. It rather aggressively propagates a conservative revolution. As we have seen, Dugin's declared animosity toward modernity is mitigated by performative contradictions when it comes to the use of communication technology and weapons of mass destruction for its own propaganda and expensive geopolitics. When Dugin himself uses irony or playfulness and explicitly labels them postmodern, this happens in a manipulative way, following a twist typical of right-wing discourses. If one agrees with Marlène Laruelle in the diagnosis of Dugin as a fascist geopolitician, one might speak of his militant fascist irony or geopolitical playfulness in the declared continuous war of teleurocracy against thalassocracy. I therefore propose to describe the neo-Eurasian attitude as polemically ludistic and militantly ironic retrofuturism. Such a militant version of retrofuturism, such as Dugin's, can and should of course be evaluated the other way around. If this happens through the means of art, this re-evaluation can give rise to retrofuturistic dystopias. A similar axiological inversion can be exemplified in literary texts by Vladimir Sorokin since at least 2006. At least since the novel Blue Lard from 1999, Sorokin has been dealing with time switches. Later with overt temporal paradoxes also. In Blue Lard, the part of the plot which is set in 2068 and that set in the early 1950s are linked together through a time machine. This double chronicity changes in Day of the Oprichnik from 2006, in Kremlin Made of Sugar from 2008, and The Blizzard from 2011. Here, futurist technology, such as three-dimensional news bulbs, are directly integrated in a pre-modern world, either reminiscent of the 16th century in Day of the Oprichnik, or the late 19th century in The Blizzard, but set in the near future of 2028. The year when Sorokin will, as I promised him, receive the Nobel Prize for Literature. And that's why I'm talking here, in order to promote this, otherwise he will not. In his 2009 article, Austrian scholar Aleksandr draws analogies between Aleksandr Dugin's justification of the Oprichnina of Ivan IV and Day of the Oprichnik. What is more, Bartosz Gołąbek argues that the novel's minor character, Duga, who redundantly pronounces Jurgeja, and nothing else, is Aleksandr Dugin, and that Dugin recognized himself in Sorokin's text. Hölwert's parallel of Dugin and Sorokin touches also on the implications of time, and I quote Hölwert. Dugin uses the critique of rationalism and universalism of Western postmodernism in order to negate modernity in pre-modernity. He does so without, however, eschewing the technological achievements of modernity. These are necessary in particular in the form of military arms and communication technology in order to contain the geopolitical enemy and to control one's own people. This paradox is unfortunately lost in Hölwer's convincing but in temporal terms one-sided suggestion of Sorokin's Dien Oprichnika as a deconstruction of the reconstruction of Dugin's neo-Eurasianist ideology. The continuous use of paradoxical overlaps of modernization and archaism in Sorokin's recent oeuvre was more explicitly and convincingly described by Boulder-based scholar Mark Lipavietsky in 2012 on the occasion of the novelette The Blizzard, and I quote Lipavietsky. The retrofuturism of The Blizzard differs from the Russia which Sorokin depicted in Day of the Oprichnik, only in the degree of radicalism, but not in the vector of extrapolation. Sorokin's utopia tangibly demonstrates the ironic effect of Russian modernization. Every new stage of this process devolves into a restitution of the archaic under the guise of utopia, under the banner of that Russia which we had lost. Along the way, every new hitch throws us back to the initial stages of modernity. This, by the way, grasps and inserts different kinds of technological innovations organically into what should seem an alien retro context. End quote. What Lipavietsky is not interested in is the meta-discursive nature of Sorokin's dystopian retrofuturism. In Sorokin's preceding novels and novelettes, this has indeed not been so unmistakably the discourse of Eurasianism, as I endeavored to show for Telluria in the following. Published in 2013, Telluria consists of 50 largely autonomous episodes, tacked together with telluric nails. These nails, if beaten directly in the brain, cause hallucinations. Through the enigmatic tellurium, several of the episodes refer to a small Altaian state, the Democratic Republic of Telluria, founded, of course, in 2028. Apart from this spatial centripetality, another invariant is shared by Telluria's 50 episodes, retrofuturism. They all play in the near future, which is characterized by asynchronous contradictions. Moscow has a nanomarket, but the great Muscovite wall could never be finished because the bricks were stolen. And elderly people still remember a Russian leader tenderly associated with cranes. Do you remember one as well? I will return to this. When it comes to the fictitious Eurasia of the near future, Sorokin parcels out the former Soviet territory into autonomous republics. This prompted Nastya Yarovaya to draw an alternative map of Russia and Europe according to Sorokin's Telluria. Retrofuturistic elements can be found in almost all episodes, but chapter 23, more intensely than all the others, delves into concepts connected with Eurasianism. This chapter tells the reader of the small Altaian state of the same name as the book, where the telluric nails that tack the episodes together originate, which can therefore be regarded as somewhat central. In this chapter, the president of Telluria, the sportive and suntanned Jean-François Trocard, flies on a microplane, as Russian President Vladimir Putin did, here it comes, on September 5th, 2012, when he accompanied Siberian white cranes for the alleged sake of ecology, but of course predominantly for political self-marketing. The country President Trocard leads, the Democratic Republic of Telluria, has reoriented economically away from Western Europe toward East Asia, as had the Putin administration already declared its intentions of doing before the sanctions of 2014. The cult of personality around Trocard is also reminiscent of Putin during his third presidential term. Sorokin renders it in a retrofuturistic way. Quote, "In the valley, small peasant houses appeared, and smoke columns, rising smoke columns whose meaning was just one. We await you, we love you, President." The compulsory retrofuturistic panegyrics with pre-modern fireplace smoke and the alleged enthusiasm of every citizen meeting the president evoke the historical prototype of the personality hype around Putin, Stalin's cult of personality. The trilingual agenda of the Republic of Teluria, however, comes closer to the Kazakh president Nursultan Nazarbayev's linguistic policy, only replacing English with the once prestigious and now retrofuturistic French. And Nazarbayev's attempts to speak Kazakh in public, and I quote, Sorokin, of course, not Nazarbayev. The president almost did not speak Altaian, but he has mastered Kazakh decently over 22 years. He read out his presidential addresses to the parliament and to the people in Kazakh. Not by chance is Trokal said to have learned Kazakh in 22 years, which is exactly the time that elapsed between the independence of Kazakhstan and the publication of Sorokin's novel. The fictitious president of Teluria displays a boyish delight in advanced technical gadgets, as known from historical films with James Bond. Quote, "The president was equipped in a black combination with a sophisticated backpack, a helmet with a respiratory apparatus on his head, and ski shoes on his feet. Like Bond actor Daniel Craig, he engages in extreme downhill skiing. His downhill slope is modeled according to retrofuturistic visions in the more narrow sense. The president acts as a flying man with wings, alluding to pre-Lindbergh enthusiasts' visions of flying men." Quote, "There was a snap in the backpack, narrow black wings emerged and opened, and two hard-firing propellers clapped and began to work." Even more widespread is retrofuturism in the broader sense of blending the modern and the archaic. The ingredients of the past cover hundreds of years of European and Russian cultural history. In the Republic of Teluria, French is the language of the elite, as in all of Europe in the 18th century. The president smokes Egyptian cigarettes and consumes cocaine like the early 20th century café society. His Moroccan-style cabinet is reminiscent of modernism, as we can find it, for example, in Munich's Villa Stuck. The site of the president's orgy with two transsexual centaurs is decorated in the style of Orientalist imaginations of the time of modernism, as you can see on the book cover of Edward Said's Orientalism. The dwelling of the Altaian peasants, whom the president visits after his ski flight ride and reside in small huts with bonfires, points back to pre-modern agriculture, mostly unchanged since the Middle Ages, which are also represented by the stone coins from Novgorod in the president's private collection. The peasants' huts with their simple fireplaces and the stone coins are the objects of a nostalgic longing. The return to them performs a psychic regression in the sense of Sigmund Freud. From the more advanced and complicated back to the simple and primary. This act of regression is accomplished by the president himself. Directly after his high-tech flight, he enjoys the pre-modern preparation of a traditional soup by an Altaian traditional three-generation family. His inner monologue absolutizes tradition. Quote, "The president already sat at the table. which had been carried out to the Alpine meadow, with the Altaïn family, and ate ketches soup with freshly baked griddle cake and sour milk. The taste of this soup, made from young lamb and lentils on a bonfire, had been as important for Jean-François Trocard as the downhill skiing from the White Mountain and the flight over the valley. It was tradition, and it was impossible to separate one from the other. The meta-commentary in the last sentence, it was tradition and it was impossible to separate one from the other. This meta-commentary claims that futurism and retro-nostalgia go together. Right after the president boards his helicopter and returns to his Alpine palace for a teleconference. This palace is situated on a slope of Beluga, the highest mountain in the Altai range. It is decorated with various Altaian objects of material culture. Headboard from massive Altaian cedar, a pillow filled with mountain herbs from the Altai. With this setting and endowment, Sorokin refers to the increasingly popular theory of Altai as the cradle of Eurasian culture, as advocated by Murat Adji, Andrei Ivanov, and others. Trocard's fascination with the snowy mountain landscape is reminiscent of Dugin's cult of the Arctic of the 1990s. The Kazakh expression mal alman, the indulgence in non-Slavic Siberian toponyms in episode 22, and the various Kazakh and Altaian words, which render the episode 28 comprehensible only with the help of the glossary at the end of the book, draw on early Eurasianist Nikolai Trubetskoy's theory of the Turanian language family. The racial exotization of Asian cheekbones of an Altaian girl with a narrow-eyed face with high cheekbones evokes the Eurasianist Lev Gumilyov's theory of ethnogenesis, while the discussion in episode 14 as to why Batu Khan did not conquer all of Europe in the 13th century refers to the glorification of the Mongolian heritage in various Eurasianist and Neo-Eurasianist publications. Eventually, the chapter 23 episode contains even explicit quotes from Eurasianist publications. The Way to the East, repeated in this chapter 3 times, quotes Piotr Sawicki's Exodus to the East, the first manifesto of the Eurasianist movement of the 1920s. The name of President Trocard is reminiscent of Jean-François Thiriart with his formula of a Europe from Lisbon to Vladivostok. Finally, the book's very title, Telluria, a fact astonishingly not noticed by any of the reviewers so far, hints obviously at Aleksandr Dugin. It refers not just to the Latin word for earth, tellus, as Alla Latinina argues, but also to Dugin's positive Eurasianist vision of tellurocratia, tellurocracy. With these explicit references to Eurasianist theories, the meta-discursive character of Sorokin's texts does something more than just cutting through any straightforward reference to reality in his novels. One might argue that the meta-discursive dimension of Telluria allows a discourse referential reading, a reading reviving the novel, referring the novel to Dugin's tellurocracy and the retrofuturism that is co-constitutive of it. Such a reading goes beyond the aesthetic routines of literary studies and opens the field for interdisciplinary approaches to literature as a particular genre of political philosophy. If read metadiscursively, the novelist Sorokin tells us something about a discourse to which he, among many others, refers about Neo-Eurasianism. The novel Telluria states that this discourse is in itself retrofuturistic. To be sure, Sorokin's meta-discursive statement is no neutral discourse analysis. It is even heavily inflected by two virtues of fiction, playfulness and irony. With his retrofuturistic fictions, Sorokin reinserts the ironic moment inherent in Western varieties of retrofuturism into the manipulative, ironic polemics of Dugin's vision of a conservative revolution and expansive geopolitics. So, encouraged by Sorokin and armored with the insight into the co-constitution of time and space provided by Kant and Bakhtin, I end with a philosophical statement about Neo-Eurasianism. There is no essence of any Eurasia beyond retrofuturistic imaginations. Thank you.